Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Welcome everyone to the Stoa and our second call of Soul Shivers. Today we have our second podcast series, and Soul Shivers is a growing collective of women working on earth regeneration in different ways, in different places, and in different forms and ways. Welcome to be here with us today, everyone. We will meet today as well as the next following 2 Tuesdays and deepen our collective inquiry around earth regeneration. And just maybe to briefly frame this dialogue series, we have selected 4 themes to guide us through the entire unscripted conversations that we have here. Last week we started to explore the topic of ancestry. Today, we dive into the field of trauma, personal, intergenerational, as well as collective trauma. And the last 2 sessions are dedicated to the theme of connecting to place, and then closed and followed up with the topic of peace. For the ones who have not been with us last time, I would just like to briefly introduce the women here with us today. My name is Luea, and I'm the creative steward of Collective Transitions, dedicated to widening the ways we see, sense, and respond across perceived divides. I'm joined by my co-lead, Freya, who is an artist and an activist living and regenerating her work in Italy. We are joined by Jane Ruka, the chairwoman of the Vaita Executive Grandmothers Council in New Zealand, Amber Tamm, a Brooklyn farmer, floral designer and horticulturist, Naomi Mwangi, she's, I think, not yet with us now. I hope she can soon join. She's a peace activist and executive director of the International Peace Initiative in Kenya. And Alexandra Gavilano, an environmental scientist and activist for societal transformation and planetary protection. This dialogue, we will start with the first 45 minutes of being in dialogue among the women here invited, and then followed by about 45 minutes of interactive questions and storytelling. We invite you to start bringing in your questions as we go through the dialogue, and so we will then call upon you, in the second part to share a bit of the question that you have put in the chat, or we can also read it for you if you indicate so. And maybe just as a little reminder, this will be recorded and will then also be shared on YouTube. And last point around practicalities, for the first part as a dialogue, we invite you to switch off your camera so that there is a kind of a clarity of who is speaking before. Then for the kind of Q&A and storytelling, you're invited to be all shining bright here. Over to you, Freya.
Thank you, Luea, and thank you everyone for being here today. Before we open our session, we wanted to read a short poem, and this poem actually inspired the name of this podcast series, which of course is Soul Shivers. So the poem is called Every Morning by Mary Oliver. I read the papers. I unfold them and examine them in the sunlight. The way the red mortars in photographs arc down into the neighborhoods like stars. The way death combs everything into gray rubble before the camera moves on. What dark part of my soul shivers? You don't want to know more about this. And then you don't know anything unless you do. how the sleepers wake and run to the cellars, how the children scream, their tongues trying to swim away, how the morning itself appears like a slow white rose, while the figures climb over the bubbled thresholds, move among the smashed cars, the streets where the clanging ambulances won't stop all day. Death and death, messy death. Death as history, death as habit. How sometimes the camera pauses while a family counts itself, and all of them are alive, their mouths dry caves of wordlessness in the smudged moons of their faces. A craziness we have so far no name for. All this I read in the papers, in the sunlight. I read with my cold, sharp eyes.
Thank you, Freya. We would love to frame a little bit why we actually selected or chosen the topic of trauma. As shared, there are different layers to it. The personal traumas, the traumas we have experienced in our own lifetime. Intergenerational trauma, meaning from within our family lineages, handed over, handed down, informing future generations. And then there is also the layer of collective trauma of tribes, communities, whole cultures and societies. And we strongly believe that no matter where we are on this planet, no matter to what tribe or culture we belong, we are actually all informed by trauma dynamics, even though we may have not experienced big traumas in our lifetime, such as war or famine or so. We all are descendants of people who have lived through many different ways of extreme situations. Not to compare them with each other, of course, but also to acknowledge we all have traces in our own systems and live in cultures and societies that are built on trauma-informed structures. And one thing that for me was very important when I explored trauma quite some years ago, and I'm actually really grateful that now we can start more talking about it, and there's more, it's more a hype word, let's say, almost, but it comes more to the surface, so we can also, in a way, are invited to also process it more consciously together. Peter Levine was, for me, a very important person who defines trauma as something that happens to us faster than we can process it. So in a way, we become traumatized when our ability to respond to a perceived threat is in some ways overwhelmed. It's not that the severity of the event that causes a traumatic response is in that sense the issue, but it's two people in the same car crash may have completely different responses to that incident. One, for example, being totally shaken but actually fine, while the other one gets trapped in a cycle of anxiety. And one reason for that is our ability to process and the resources we have to move through the stages of our body's reaction to a dangerous situation, which is kind of the fight, flight, or freeze response. And if we somehow get trapped there, in a way, trauma kind of is a physiological reaction in our system. And so it's really important to know when we approach also healing trauma and working with it, that it's actually something to work through our bodies to create that healing space or the conditions that healing can take place and can unfold in its own natural way, and reactivating our body's wisdom in that. And so from that perspective, knowing it's really a physiological reaction, actually really a somatic reaction, and from the eyes that we approach regeneration as something that is the inclusion of and the collaboration between the energetic, the social, and the ecological layers, and enhances the interconnected dynamics between that to create life-affirming and living systems, we almost could say that regeneration is needed as a form, as a response to how we lived with century-old and probably most time longer trauma-informed dynamics and systems. So regeneration actually being one of the responses we as not only individuals, but also as peers, tribes, communities, humanity itself has to embrace and not shy away to create the preconditions for working through the trauma layers and in a way unfreeze that stuck energy that is in our systems and societies. And before we go into dialogue, I just want to acknowledge also that this conversation may bring in us all up some intensity of memories or whatever, and just knowing we do have a wonderful tool called the breath that is in a way a form of grounding ourselves, even if that conversation here may kind of stir up things. So whenever you feel something is moving, to actually use our breath as our kind of guidance to stay present and grounded. Yeah, and with that, I would love to open with the question to our dear women here. How have you as an individual and you with your community or your peers danced with these trauma-informed dynamics so far? And what is the first story that comes up when you hear that word?
Thank you so much, Luea, for sharing and kind of opening this topic like this. I feel and I felt triggered while you were talking, and already felt triggered when coming to this call today of what has been happening in my life the last week, just again kind of reminding me of traumas throughout my life, throughout my ancestors' lives. But the first image that came right now when you asked us what is kind of system-driven trauma, I like this expression. I hear it like this for the first time, like system-driven trauma. And I had this image of soil. I mean, of course, I mean, you've heard I've been working in sustainable land and water management on a research field and as an activist. And this is just one thing, or when we look at this kind of what are system-driven traumas, I just thought like soil, how so often intensely managed soil is traumatized and it needs to recuperate and it needs to be evolved. And sometimes it needs even human support to be, but actually just, adaptable for a human need. The soil in itself will be good as it is. It doesn't have the need to produce for humans. It just wants to kind of be. And I just felt like we see this reflected everywhere if we open our eyes. Like we see trauma on so many layers that sometimes we are the victims, but sometimes we are the ones doing it and creating it, and not just between humans or not just in a way of abuse, but just in a way of how we understand that it's okay to behave as human. That's why we're kind of, we're not destroying the planet, right? A lot of people say, we're destroying our planet. We're not destroying the planet, because the planet will be long after us still, but we're destroying the environment that is good for our species and a lot of other species that now can live well under this condition on this planet. We are destroying that. So yeah, I even just felt that this expand of layers goes even beyond what happens just in human dimensions, but actually in all of the dimensions of what we can perceive.
How is it for you, Jane or Amber? How do you relate to this topic, theme, field?
I think there's so many things going on in my head. I think trauma, I would label it something. I feel like I've always seen trauma, but I'll start by saying trauma is very seen. It's very seen in media, and storytelling through media and film. And I love media and film for that because you can see yourself reflected. But I think growing up, I didn't understand that some of the things I was enduring were traumatic, or some of the environments I was in were traumatic, or that the environments that I was in were informed by systematic trauma or like collective. Like I really had no clue. And so for me, my only close relationship with trauma was watching my mom go through the trauma of losing her parents as a very young woman. But I still couldn't connect it. I couldn't connect it in the sense of my mom was pregnant with me as she was going through this. So I didn't know these parents that she spoke of. So I didn't know grandparents. I didn't know great grandparents. So watching her go through her trauma at the age of 22 or 25, that's kind of what I knew. That was like the little glimpse that I had. But I easily realized that trauma is almost like a superpower once I went through something very massive, as in my father murdering my mom. And then I was able to see how, wow, years of this can lead to more of it. I don't think previous to me going through it on my own, I could hear that or see that. But I think watching my mom go through this huge mourning time that never stopped until the day that she died, only to then be saying the same things that she was saying to me as a kid, I understood intergenerational trauma and how that ties into collective trauma and how that then ties into, like, I think that's what sprung me into the interconnectedness of it. But like Alexandra was just saying, soil, right? And like, that's what it all brought me back to, is like me going through my own personal trauma and going through the trauma systems absolutely brought me back to soil and honoring, like Alexandra just said, the trauma of the soil, but through people first. I think I had to really recognize what land I was on, how my ancestors were brought here, what the land is holding people-wise, like bones-wise, fertilizer-wise, trauma-wise, and then getting to a Mama Earth perspective in terms of working with the soil and needing that regeneration. So I for sure will say trauma, personal trauma informed me on the other different types of traumas, but I for sure have always felt like trauma is some weird sort of sight. It helps you understand others. It helps you understand interconnectedness as a whole.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of freeze on my internet. Thank you so much, Amber and Alexandra. Because I'm older than you, I hesitate always to speak first. I really enjoy hearing the trauma, the life battles of all of you young people. And from my vintage, intergenerational trauma is very close. And it can come in the form of anything that disturbs your community. And that intergenerational trauma could come from another nation, superimposing themselves onto you, or taking you from your community and replanting you somewhere else as a totally different self-image that you had or your ancestors had for you. Tanya? Gone. My screen is gone. I may need to.
We hear
Oh,
you.
good. I think it's the destruction that the original trauma intergenerationally is condoned in some manner by the communities who can't retaliate to it. And if they do, huge consequences are exerted on ancestral people. And amber represents that end line, Alexandra to some extent as well. Naomi is walking through it at this present time in Kenya. Luea and Freya, just because I don't mention you, you are included in this for your ancestral traumas, because we all know the history of Europe. And it has consequences from the original trauma down to, personally, my generation of grandchildren. You do not ever revert back to where you were and your ancestors were originally. You must just be very strong to regenerate yourself in the place where you are. If that involves changing your country, your residence, your community, where you sit on land, then you are honored bound to do that for your next generations, to improve yours so that they have some values to find. Your next generation of children, nieces, nephews, whoever is in your lineage of blood, will see that you've done it. Being an example is really very important. People need to see that you can achieve. And intergenerational trauma includes trauma to the surroundings, Alexandra, to the land that you live on, and how occupiers who traumatize you cause destruction to what you thought of as your pristine livelihood, where you are connected to everything in that area. Every being and sentient creature has a right to be there. And then suddenly you're all devastated and nobody has a right except the people coming to utilize all the areas that they can in order to increase financial gain. And you have no way to stop that. So really, you need to first regain your own balance. And then you must look at your surroundings. And if your soils are damaged, you cannot grow food. Self-production of your survival is the next thing to deal with. And if that means you have to go down to the supermarket, but first you must earn the money to buy it. But really, the consequences of that are repetitive. Whereas if you have a plot of land and you can grow rice, cabbages, vegetables, you're halfway to survival and regeneration. The whole picture of regeneration is so important, but it begins with you and your understanding. I'm not saying that we can dismiss our intergenerational traumas. I'm saying that we need to view them in all honesty as to how you can improve them existing where you are. And that means if you have to cooperate with a country that stewards you in the wrong direction. You have to really be like Naomi and adjust to that traumatization that hasn't left you. But you know, if you've planted vegetables, your children have helped you to grow them. They are going to know how to survive at a really ground level. And you know, it's viewing from my age, the state of where I am. I really am a very loud activist. I oppose everything that I know from my long travel through life is not appropriate to the people growing up that belong to my iwi, my people. So I oppose it, and I'm very loud. I hear you all saying you're activists of various causes, and really they're just life causes, aren't they? If we look at it, look at them. Please don't let me go on forever on this issue. I haven't even touched personal trauma. I think we all have personal traumas. Some of them are by degree more devastating. And you cannot get more trauma than seeing your mother or being the child of a mother whose father has caused her life to end. And I do send out my heartfelt grief of your situation that you have so bravely come out of, Amber. I send to you my best wishes, dear, for your ceasing the generational trauma so that your children don't receive what you're living through. God bless you in the form of blessing of my culture. I send that to you, Amber, so that your children do not get traumatized. Give them the life of hope, my dear. Thank you for the moment.
It's incredible for me. It took me a long time to think of regeneration this way. I think because a lot of psychological and mental programming that happened when I joined the workforce, for example. But I've come to think that one of the most powerful forms of activism and regenerative work happens at a family scale. And I hear all of you speaking to that really beautifully. And I've also had the feeling of going out into nature and walking around and walking the hills behind my house and sensing something that I couldn't name, but that I have come to know over time as being closer to a sense of feeling whole, and realizing that one of the sort of systemic traumas that I think we've mentioned is this trauma of separation from the land, separation from each other as we moved out of tribes and out of villages, out of communities into concrete boxes in urban areas, or even those of us who live rurally, still we feel isolated from each other. And that regeneration, when done well, involves entering back into relationship with each other, with the land, with a whole set of different factors. And so I always say, you know, regenerative development or regeneration is not just about nature, right? It's about relationship. And this is something we also talked about in our session last week. You know, storing our knowledge in relationships, drawing from our ancestry to inform decisions, to inform the work that we do in the world. One, I just want to say quickly, as I began to think of regeneration along those lines, I started to, maybe it was more spiritual awakening or something along those lines, but I noticed myself becoming more sensitive to the world. As I opened up to the possibility of more relationships around me, I became more sensitive to them. And that was, on the one hand, a blessing because I became aware of immeasurable beauty that was accessible to me at any moment if I decided to see it and work with it and be with it. And on the other hand, it, I couldn't read the newspaper anymore without falling into a depression or crying, or couldn't walk by that homeless person on the street without feeling um, incredible pain at the suffering that is equally alive, next to the beauty in any given moment. And I'm wondering if many of you can speak to that tension, as we enter back into the complex sets of relationships around us and we become more sensitive, we also become more sensitive to the pain, at least, and that's my experience. How do you work with that tension of being right there in the thick of not only personal and, trauma that we can feel and touch in our own lives, but also that of the world, and still be able to function and work on it responsibly?
I will start by saying this is something I'm absolutely still figuring it out. I think Luea's definition of trauma alludes to that. Like, I think trauma hits and it can be overwhelming, so it can cause knee-jerk reactionary responses. And I think a lot of my traumatic responses have been like that. And it's not until now that I can really hear Jane say something like, we need regeneration, or you need to focus on yourself. And I actually get that. And so that's what I would really put forth is, I think COVID has positioned us to be in an internal state and in a place of slowing down, not because we necessarily want to, but because we have to on some level. And if you're going to slow down, it's likely that you should not have those knee-jerk reactions. And I think a lot of my super intensely trauma-informed years, I had no room, space, time to slow down. I just was going every day. And now once again, another place that I'm getting to 7 years later after losing my parents, I'm recognizing that, man, I should have slowed down a long time ago. I should have been looking into these crevices within myself a long time ago. But instead I was like, I need to save money for my siblings, and I need to try to do this, and I need to focus on my career. And it's not until I got here to say, like, a career, I chose a career over myself. I chose a career over personal regeneration, or I chose regenerative agriculture over regenerative amber. And that's not a shun, or like, I'm not ashamed, or I don't have regret, but I can see how in not choosing yourself, you can't be helpful. And one thing, me and my partner say to each other is like, we can't fight a food apartheid, but be malnourished people. We can't fight this fight of food justice and like, we're hungry. That's not gonna make for a really healthy answer or a really healthy adjustment right now. So I think I'm at the coordinate of balancing that out finally, and choosing myself and what I want on a personal level over how I'm trying to impact my community. I think that's a super important coordinate, is that balancing tip that it's going to have to be adjusted to on the daily. You're never going to be balanced, but it's something that you can keep trying to adjust to on the daily. But I do want to say, I don't think that they're like, it's just something that constantly has to be worked towards.
Yeah, Thank you. I feel so similar. Like I also, when I think I accepted my traumas and I accepted pain, to feel pain. I also had a few years that I ran away and I kind of did more and more, and I had to get very like sick personally on a health level that expressed kind of how long I was ignoring it. So I'm definitely, I do not have the one solution, but I actually also got more sensitive towards myself and, you know, feeling, not just feeling on how do I feel, but really also already feeling, you know, the smallest changes in my body that I felt that are not good. And I, for example, I think I got like approached or learned about trauma just for my love for nature when I was really young, and like with 7 years, when I kind of first had this like deep encountering with, oh, this is why I'm here. But it definitely starts within yourself. Like I absolutely agree on this. You need to kind of, this is the first level of trauma and of self-love also that we can encounter. And one thing that I personally find very difficult is just to, and that was also what happened to me last week, is kind of being very aware also of certain traumas that I healed or that I overcome in certain ways, not even traumas, but kind of systemic reactions, like system-driven trauma reactions. I'm just taking up on what you said, Luea, kind of, you know, ways of how I behave, how I deal with problems, that I was really in the last 10 years, I was so working intensively on that. And I just feel in certain aspects, like I feel like either I have to choose for myself and look for the good for what is good for me, or I choose love or family, you know, over it. And that's where I really, last week, I came into shaking and I felt like, hey, that's not fair. Like, it's not fair that I'm kind of try to pull back into my trauma when, and I just felt so much, and I went into nature. So that helps me a lot to just go out and be with nature and sing, or, you know, just kind of balance myself. And then I usually feel to the core what actually is what I want. But I have to do that very consciously, because if I stick in the situation, I kind of tend to just put it away and not feel it anymore, you know, and fall into this old behavior schemes. I find that definitely challenging, but I also find it so important to talk about it, because when I started my journey in personal trauma healing when I was 20, and I feel like I had so many things that I already was used to behave like, used to think like, used to categorize, you know, and this is something we don't learn. Like, we don't learn that. And it's usually, I would say, in the European Western society at least, but even also I think in Peru, in the rural cities, it also has the same tendency, unfortunately, that people, you know, they feel it as bad, or feel they need to be ashamed if they need support. And I feel like talking about and saying, hey, instead of when somebody says I need, you know, to find a therapist or somebody who helps me, usually people tend to say, oh, are you not that good? Instead of saying, wow, it's so impressive that you know what you need and that you're, you know, so strong to also speak about it and just do it. And I feel that's something that as a society we can learn and we can inspire, to create those safe spaces that people actually can feel safe to, you know, look to the inside. Because as I can say, like, when I looked to the inside, I wanted to run away first again.
When you say that, then actually what comes up is this trauma feels only, I mean, at least from my personal experience or what I've witnessed in with friends and family and colleagues, a threat if it's individualized, if it's compartmentalized, that it's my thing I have to deal with on my own. And if it's not embraced by the family, the community, whatever I feel I belong to, as I come with that, and it's part of me, and it is welcomed and embraced with all that it's teaching, with all that it's informing, not only me as an individual, but also the community as a signal, as a source of information, rather than something to put under the carpet, to hide away, to put in the shade, to pretend maybe even it's not there. And then therefore also not receiving the resources and the support and the care and the love for embracing it as something that just wants, yeah, to be embraced, basically. Yeah, so that's and that brings me also to this question. I mean, I feel like I have grown up in an environment that indeed has not taught me how to be with it. I had nature as my teacher, and therefore also this, when we talk about earth regeneration, also this, on one hand, it's the unlimited resource that I experienced in my own life so far, as if nothing else is there, I know nature is there. And I, even if it's in the city, I can hug a tree and part of me feels whole. But knowing that this is, to a certain extent, depending also where we live, but in general under threat, knowing that a lot of people are shaken through that fact, like that this unlimited resource and presence in itself is under threat just by our trauma-informed behaviors, basically. Yeah, and so I'm curious also to hear how maybe your community, and I'm especially also looking to you, Jane, as an elder from an indigenous First Nation tribe. What are your resources as community to consciously hold these movements and these dynamics when they show up?
I am. I hear you all saying, you go to nature, you go to the trees, you go to the soil when these tensions and pressures are upon you and you need to have converse with something that helps you in the place where you are at that time. Now, our belief system is that we are related to everything that has life. And Freya, you say you walk in the trees, you walk in the park behind you. Somebody else was saying they get, Alexandra, I think you said you, these are, in our cultural belief systems, the trees and the plants and the animals came first. Humanity came last. And when you're troubled, you refer to something that's lived longer than you so that you might benefit from their life's journeys. And that's where nature is so undeserved where it stands on the planet. Everything that takes life out of the planet and surrounding it is your source of comfort, because they are elder brothers and sisters, grandmothers and grandfathers, some of them centuries old, our trees. Now, in those centuries, there are methods of surviving. But we, because we've lived 60, 70, 52 years, we totally are unaware, most of us, that we have seniority growing in our own gardens. The trees and the grass have whakapapa, ancient whakapapa. The animals in the ocean itself is a goddess to be. The life form that's in it is a goddess. These resources, therefore, are used as messengers. If you can still hear me, I'll continue.
We can still hear you.
In order to use, all right, in order to access those beautiful brothers and sisters, ancient as they are, all we have to know is let them know that you are traumatized. Go to them and don't just hug them. Tell them your anxieties. If you have a bird flying through into your property and you are heart bound with trauma, it's a life force that's learned through its generational genealogy how to survive. It's your best friend at the time. My personal best friend when I'm overloaded at being a traumatized person, seeing that our state is traumatizing my Indigenous culture, I go to the nearest patch of trees that belong to me. By that I mean everything belongs to me that belongs to nature. It's my given right as the youngest child on this planet to ask for help from them. I don't just sit and do silent help. I tell them my traumas. I cry to them. And the moment I've cried for my heartfelt trauma, I know that I'm relieved because they've picked it up. And if I'm in a bush with multiple trees growing, all those root systems are going to hear my cry to my elders, and they are going to be very sorry for me because they can feel my honesty. But then on the other hand, when they are traumatized by a threat, I am vociferous in my defense of them. So it's this exchange and acknowledgement that we all suffer trauma. And when we're in that bound up stage where the only release is tears, and you sit down on the ground or you hug whatever's in your arms and you cry, you give that to 1,000 ears of nature. And imagine 1,000 ears receiving and holding your trauma. It's not going to be very long before your relief is felt because your elder brothers and sisters are taking it. And remember, when it's their turn to have trauma, you stand up and be the biggest and loudest activist for their protection. Not because they require it, but because your heartfelt knowledge tells you they save humans. And what are some parts of the humanity destroying them for? So those of us who are aware that they are our elder brothers and sisters, and they help us, are required by our neurological systems to go and offer them succor. And in that manner, you grow bigger and they grow with you for their trauma. And then when it's your trauma and they isolate it and spread it out among them, you grow bigger because your trauma has taught you a lesson, and you go to the only people who can relieve it are your senior brothers and sisters. And that's my kōrero I offer to you. You all have touched it already. You acknowledge it. Verbalize it, because if you verbalize it, not just the one you're holding closest to you hears it. Go out and tell nature, this is my saddest trauma. I need you to help me. And they respond because they have senses, just as we do. I give you that kōrero from my culture. Kōrero is speaking and gifting of words. And I hope it helps you because you already all touch it. Multiply us by the thousands of people who go in to get relief. We've got a force that can defend our brothers and sisters because they defend us if we talk to them. Speaking in your mind is all right, but verbalizing it means the ones in the distance catch it on the wind and they can hear it. So it's not just the few that you're talking to as you're walking. It's to the brothers and sisters that have been caught by the god of the winds. Tawhiri Mātea is the god of winds, and takes your sorrow and gifts it to the brothers and sisters who are older than us. So thank you.
I just want to jump in because Jane always hits it on the head. But I think this is incredibly important because with Black History Month in America right now, the media is like filled with these depictions of, you know, civil rights era, or like these new dark horror genre movies about, you know, Black Americans today, but like they're back in slavery, etc. And I think one of the most beautiful things I can see is that America will applaud, you know, a seer like Harriet Tubman for her ability to utilize nature to get to freedom. And when I hear that, it makes me almost sob because I'm envisioning a bunch of my ancestors venturing through nature, but doing their best to be quiet, doing their best to blend in, climbing a tree for the sake of safety, you know, doing bird sounds for the sake of communicating. But the reality is, for me and my community, that we've never went into nature for joy, and we've never went into nature comfortable. We've never went into nature with conversation. Nature was almost a portal to freedom, and that's all it ever was. So by the time you got from the American South to the American North, yes, you had experienced nature, but it was for safety precautions only. It was to literally wade in the water, but like the water wasn't your friend because you enjoyed it. It was your friend because it got you to freedom. And so I do think a big part for those of us who are Black American is to revitalize the relationship with nature through conversation, beyond it being a safe haven, but through conversation solely.
That's so powerful, Amber. Thank you. We have some really beautiful questions in the chat. So I'd love to call on, actually, why don't we just turn on our cameras now, if you feel comfortable, so we can open up the room. And how we're gonna do this is I'm gonna call on you and you can ask your question. But if you don't wanna be on YouTube, that's fine. We're also happy to read the question on your behalf. So Maria Clara, do you wanna start us off with your wonderful question that you put in just a few minutes ago?
Yes, sure. I asked about how do you feel the collective trauma can open space for regenerative and decolonial societies? Thank you.
I mean, I can, oh, go ahead, Alexandra.
Sure. I just can share on how I've been approaching it with my group of with the group of people from around the world within Extinction Rebellion. So we kind of have like workshops kind of just introducing regenerative cultures, where also these levels of care, plus as Extinction Rebellion we also have the action care, obviously. So it's kind of this additional layer, but these different layers we kind of spend time to really kind of enable people in older languages that are requested to really, you know, dive into the topic and kind of make first experiences. So I feel like that's kind of a very first step to just introduce the topic. And once you are on a collective trauma level, I feel like what I observe in the last 2 years is that within Extinction Rebellion, there have a lot of exchange platforms emerge that people felt they need. So kind of, you know, learning circles and exchange circles from people from all over the world that have entire different contexts and that find themselves in spaces that do not have a structure. Like it doesn't have to be like, this is our agenda and this is what we want to achieve, but it's kind of, yeah, going back to the safe space. It's kind of a safe space where people can actually show and learn about these other relationships. And there, what I actually learned is that decolonization, which for me personally was important, being Swiss Peruvian, kind of, you know, I was, this was kind of the first thing where I kind of looked at, but being in this international exchange, I actually realized it's not really about decolonization, but it's actually about oppression, because that is what all the communities know, and they all know it in their layers, and colonialism kind of being like the trump of all of that, kind of the top, the you know, the one that changed history on such a global level as well. And yeah, it's not really an answer, sorry, it's just kind of a sharing where we are now and what I observed for now, kind of having the slowness and having the safety spaces for people. Luea, go next, please.
Yeah, thank you for this question, because if I would personally put it blunt, we cannot have regeneration and decolonization movements without going to the collective trauma layers as well. Because in a way, if we look where the source of our fractured and pain-filled societies are, it has so much to do with our interwoven trauma patterns and storylines. And I feel often that, and of course we can't, like what you just shared, Alexandra, it's a form of building resources, because I would say most of us have not grown up, like we just also heard from several ones, in societies where we are in a way actively invited to train what are our resources when we deal with intensity, which is part of life. Like, it's nothing wrong to go through intensity. The question is, where are my resources, being that human species or any form of life that can support and carry me through. And so building that first layer as small groups or communities or peer groups, to actually start to feel like we do have that in our system, our bodies, our collective bodies actually know it. There is so much wisdom we often not tap into, because they're of course like crushed by these trauma-informed layers. And so I feel like a part of the Earth regeneration movement is to build in us and between us and among us and in relationship with all that life is, again, these resources to just be with what hurts, be with what's not nice, but also be therefore also not blending out the beauty at the same time. Like Freya, you also mentioned, like when I embrace beauty, the more I become open for that, of course, the more I also feel the intensities that maybe are not so comfortable. And for me, actually, part of the work that I feel called to is actually normalize these layers of our collective stories, including our collective trauma stories, no matter where we come from, no matter to which society and parts of the world we belong. But also not, of course, say we only have to go there and forget the work in action, but kind of include that as part of as a very clear statement of action. While going in, we also create capacity in the outer.
There's this great anarchist line that says all oppression is interconnected. And what's clear is that there's, trauma has and is playing out across nested scales constantly, right? And that it's passed down, and that's sort of the how trauma moves. And I found that really interesting. And I love this calling on sort of collective trauma work and trauma work to become normalized in the professional environments that I've been in, it's not normal at all to draw attention to trauma. And funny enough, once you start to attune yourself to trauma and its, spectrum of expressions, you realize that the people you work with, the people you live with, our societies essentially operate, very much so from a place of trauma, from a wounded place. And once you start to recognize that, you start to question, well, this person's an egomaniac, or maybe they're saving whales, but they're not even paying attention to their family, and that call to normalize this work and not push it into a category of, oh, that's yours to deal with on your own, I think is really critical. And yeah, I hope that happens, that we can all sort of continue to build the field of mutual support and awareness around this, so that this work can make its way into perhaps even really surprising contexts, because that's so needed. We had Ola, who wanted to share something. Do we have Ola on the line still?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Just want to say thank you to you guys for everything you shared. And like, this is the first time I'm having like a deeper understanding of how trauma works, and I'm making connections between experiences in my life and the experiences that I've seen in other people's lives around me. So in my own case, I live in Nigeria, and the trauma is so bad that we can't have effective communication without shouting at each other. That is how we tend to communicate. And looking back at my own experience with my own mom and how she passed her own trauma onto me, and how I had to do a lot of work on myself without even understanding the concept of trauma, into forgiving her for not knowing, and still seeing how she is still reeling in that trauma and not being able to help. It bothers me seeing how it's also transferring to my own sisters. And I'm looking at it from a perspective of how long Nigeria is going to be Nigeria if we continue to like operate this way. And when Jane said that that you should be willing to like change your environment, so that the next generation can have a better experience, I have noticed that my friends who live abroad still have like traces of this trauma in them, even though they changed their environment, right? So I'm not sure if I'm trying to make connections to where the regeneration would come from. Is it going to be like from within, like from self, or a shared understanding of what trauma is? But yeah, I just want to say thank you to you guys, and to Amber. I left a lot of details out with my experience, but this conversation really hits home for me, and I was really close to tears. So thank you guys.
I'd just like to your comment of moving place. I really am heartfelt for all these sins of colonization. We are still in our colonization in my country. By moving out of your environment, you first must, as you have done, recognize your trauma, personal or community trauma. By changing environments, I'm talking about your mental environment, your physical environment, and your running away environment. If that's how you choose to deal with your personalized trauma, is to remove yourself totally out of it and into another country. That's your only effort that you can put to the moment that you're traumatized. For those who can stand still, trauma is persistent, and in order that the possibility that you are standing still means that you think you are strong enough to change your personal mental environment and stand upright, still protesting about what has traumatized you. If you are still standing in that trauma, then you must be prepared to give your life for it in circumstances that everybody else would run away from. And I wish you well on finding your balance. It's a personal, real personal acknowledgement of yourself where you are when you're truthfully looking at your trauma and deciding how are you going to cope with it. And there is no question that we sometimes need to run away into a place that's no longer traumatizing us and go happily there if it means you need to go there to survive. But some of us remain and actively stand in front of the trauma because that's the way they can cope with it. And that's why you need to personally change and adjust yourself to regenerate if whatever activity you choose to take needs your action. The trauma has presented itself to you. You have taken it into your heart and body and your mind, your surroundings. It belongs to you. Then your mind responds, your wairua responds. Your wairua is your mana. Your mana is your spirit and your essential being. And traumatized people respond only how their essential central being or mana is able to cope with it. If running away keeps you alive and you're able to develop into a stronger person, then that's what you need to do. Nobody can tell you how you can respond. Your essential being knows what's good for it and what isn't good for it. And if it requires you to run away, then you must do that, because you're no good standing up in front of the trauma if you already know that you need to move from it. If you're one of these people who can stand there and decide, no, I'm not going to go anywhere, then that's your decision to deal with your life trauma in that place. And neither has any consequence to anybody else but to you. And your mana needs to accept that. Your essential being is a mana. And if you accept that, then that's your learning from that particular trauma. We're switching from community trauma down to personal trauma. And you're the only person who knows how to deal with that. I wish you well, Ola.
I just want to reinforce what Jane said, because I think the hardest part of going through extreme personal trauma and to what this being was just presenting is like once you got your observations down, once you can look at your family or yourself and be like, oh my God, like what is all of this and what do we do with all of this? It really is 1000% up to you. And that is the hardest part. Like when I think of my journey, I was like the perfect student and the perfect Black girl from the hood and like a really great example of an African American doing what's right. And that was really because I was just whatever an adult was telling me to do, I was doing. I was on the right track. And I think once my trauma came and knocked me onto a different track where I had autonomy, I didn't have grandparents or parents. An auntie and uncle could not tell me how to go about my life because this trauma was so different than what has been in our family or what anyone has seen or heard. That autonomy is abundance, but it can feel like such a burden. It can really like, I need someone to tell me what to do. And the reality is that people will tell you, but it won't fit. And so for me, I did run away. I did go to Hawaii and I did travel all of the US only to come back to my hometown, to be back on the same streets where I was with my parents to try and help this community. So I do think that that's a part of that process. Is leaving enabled me to just focus on me. But coming back, I had focused on me enough to then focus on community because now I am my community. So I do think that that process of like observation and then maybe you do go someplace to just focus on your personal trauma, to come back to your communal or family trauma is super healthy. And I want to quote unquote normalize that. But I think the other side, and this is something I've said to Black communities several times, is I love my people enough to leave them sometimes. Like I can't try to take on the burden to get everybody in the projects to walk with me into the return of the land. Like that's just not, people are on their own processes and they're processing their own things. So only I can go if that's what I feel is right. And I know when it comes to family, that's super complicated to like leave your family because maybe you're progressing and observing through this trauma, but they aren't yet. But you can't shame them or try to force them. It's like sometimes you just have to go and do your own thing and really lean on Mama Earth and lean on prayer that one day maybe we can have a conversation or you can be here. But my quote and how I've gotten through life, especially with Black community, is like, I love them enough to leave them. I love them enough to step away and say, I know that this is the truth, even though my whole community thinks it's not the truth.
Incredible. Joshua, and welcome, Naomi. We're so glad that you were able to join us just at the end.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We had a great question from Joshua. Joshua, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Hello, good evening, good day. Thank you guys, thank you women for being here and talking and sharing your wisdom and your truths. I was in the talk last week and I was kind of inspired with this question feeling. I think it kind of relates well to some of what has been talked about. I think especially what Jane and Amber have just spoken to, of maybe inner knowings or connecting to our being and kind of being in relationship with our being present with ourselves so that we know that. And I think that, so my question is based on, we use, or we're brought up in a Western culture to focus on five senses as how we make sense of the world. And I think that that's very limiting and separating us from the world. And I think that our language, just not just our language, but the way we approach being needs updates or additions. So the question I guess I would like to put in the group is, what other senses should we be using to help us realize what our being is telling us?
Thank you for this beautiful question. Because it feels so relevant to this topic, but it also feels so relevant, I mean, to trauma, but also so relevant to regeneration in itself. And for me, there are so many senses we don't use that we have innate in us. And that may have been shut down by traumatic experiences or trauma-informed experiences. So there is this interrelation, I think. One sense that for me was very important is to regain the sense of a felt sense, like not a feeling in terms of emotion, but trusting my body to feel and allow, for example, the shaking when I have something intense going on, that somatic sense, to use my body as an instrument of trusting these feelings. Some people may call it intuition or a gut feeling or so. And I think we have this kind of loose terms, but to allow to feel things and allow things to also even move through my body, not to get stuck in it necessarily, but like let it travel through me and feel that my body is a conduit in a way to allow things that either happen to me or kind of are intergenerationally handed over to me or in the collective field, to kind of process it through my felt sense, my body sense, that I don't know, it's not just the taste or the touch, but yeah, so that's just what comes up as a form of processing that trauma-informed dynamics that are partially also really physiologically stored in our bodies, and allowing that to defreeze in a way.
It's interesting, sort of balancing between the individual trauma and the collective trauma. I remember acute experiences of struggling with individual trauma. And then when I became a mother, I was forced into immediately caring for someone else. And through that experience, found deep connection and healing. And then have in other situations had a similar experience when I'm feeling down about something and I put myself in service of helping someone else. There's this strange and just mysterious healing that comes up. So yeah, I mean, I also really resonated with what Amber said, which is, I love my community enough to leave them sometimes. So that get out of there is also totally part of the solutions set, right? So anyway, yeah, it's like, how can we attune ourselves with more than 5 senses to really understanding what's needed in that specific moment. We just have a few more minutes, and I'm wondering if Naomi has a good enough connection to come in. Naomi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Freya. Thank you. So I'm sorry, guys. I just got in late. There wasn't power here, so I was praying and hoping it comes back, and it just came back right on the time of finishing the group discussion. I think I had a little trauma on that, but I'm happy I'm here. um, so trauma is, speaking of trauma, it's just a huge word for me. And when I hear the word trauma, I just hear stuckness, being in a space that I can't move, my mind can't move, and my heart can't move. And it brings me back to the connection between my mind and heart, that my mind knows that there is a possibility to move forward in a trauma that I am affected in, but at the same time my heart is very rigid to let go of that situation for me to be willing to invite either forgiveness or tenderness or calmness and things like that. And I've been in so many different trauma scenarios in my life, and one of the biggest trauma was finding forgiveness, because of so many things that have happened in my life that I never thought I would pass through them. And so even right now, the systems that we have, especially I'm talking about Kenya because I have connected with my country so much that I know the traumas that keep us stuck in as a country and we can't move forward. And I'll go back to our previous conversation that we had on our last call, that Jen did put it very nicely about the patriarchy society that is holding us back. And I, as a woman, I have carried that trauma of not wanting to engage with a male gender that is not like-minded as I am, or does not feel the same sense of humanity that I am feeling. And I've been stuck with that trauma of, if I am so selective of the male genders that I want to involve in my life, then it means my entire life I'll be so selective. And so the trauma that has been building and building and building around me is on the selection of who to engage with and who not to engage with. And sometimes I feel like I'm being judgmental, and it just goes around, circling around and around of the traumas that I've passed through in my life that is making me have these decisions that I am making in my life. But then I'm realizing, if I am not going to be willing to realize and be aware of this stuckness that I am having, then I won't be able to even invite the forgiveness that I want, or the tenderness that I want, or the mercy that I want for myself and for the others who are around me, and just being patient with how my life is guiding me. So trauma is something that I can keep going on and talking about. And right now I am involved in a group of amazing facilitators who are helping people deal with traumas. And I am practicing to work through those exercises. There are like 6 amazing exercises that enable someone to get away from the trauma-minded section and the body stagnant section. And I'd really love to continue having these conversations with anyone who is interested, to knowing the tension release exercises. Whenever you feel like you're in a tension space, or you're having a new job and you don't know how you can handle that, or the situations that are happening at home and things like that. So I would love to share that exercises with anyone who is interested for more conversations, because I know we are running out of time and I don't want to take most of the time. Yeah, so that is my piece today, that I wanted to come in with a lot of more deeper conversations, but yeah, I'm happy to stop at that point, and hopefully I'll have more time on my next call when we meet again.
I have a feeling we will be revisiting this again and again and again together. It's such a big topic, and Naomi, we're so glad that you were able to join us just here in the last minutes of the call. It's been really nice to see you and welcome you into the space. And is there anyone else who wants to come in and close us out, or do any of our guests want to have any words or thoughts? Please come forward if you feel called to.
I just had one thought that was with me, one feeling, and I just would like to share it and take from it whatever you feel called to. Once we are born, once we're in the womb, we are connected. We're connected to the body of our mother. And then suddenly we come to life, to the planet Earth, and we experience this connection. And we just have to trust. So we flow through this magic channel that kind of brings us to this world, and we get disconnected from our mother who has nourished us. We walk our lives as human, as one of a species on this planet. And we try to reconnect, and we try to overcome this distance until we suddenly see and look in the mirror and realize it's within me. This is the distance I wanted to overcome. And suddenly we pass away and we die and we dissolve into soil, and we're again one with all this that has held us. That was kind of the image that I felt through this call. Let's trust, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today. And we hope to see you next Tuesday. We will be discussing connection to place. So please join us then at the same time. Be well, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.